Hello, this is Michael Sulak, and this video is just going to be a quick introduction on how to actually program with R. I'm going to be using RStudio as my interface with the R programming language. R and RStudio are both free open source pieces of software. If you go to RStudio's homepage and you find the download link, there are some versions that you have to pay for, but the one that does everything you need is the free desktop version. So here's RStudio, and the console is this window here that has a blinking cursor on an input line, and like any other computer programming language, you have to type in commands that you want to accomplish. There isn't a lot of pointing and clicking available. This cursor is asking me for what commands I might want to do. So one of the most basic things you can do in R is just treat it like a calculator. You can perform multiplication. So I've typed in my command here, and when I hit enter, the result runs. I see the numeric result and just a little prompt here telling me this is the first line of the output. A couple things about R. One is that spacing doesn't really matter. You could even have it extremely spaced out, still getting the same result. Another thing is that R is case sensitive generally, so whether something is lowercase or uppercase matters. So for example, there is an absolute value function, and that function is called ABS. If instead I tried to capitalize that, I'm getting an error message that there's no function called that. So generally spaces don't matter, but uppercase and lowercase do. A nice little feature is when you're working in the console, you can use your up arrow or down arrow to scroll through older commands that you've done. So the console is a really easy, quick way to interact with R and to run R commands. But if you're going to be creating anything that's more in depth, it's probably a good idea to use what's called an R script. If I go to New File here in RStudio and I choose a new script, now I have a space where I can write down commands, and then I can save those commands to run later. For example, here's just a couple of commands in R. I can run each line individually by clicking on this button or using the shortcut depending on what operating system you're running. You can run all the commands in a script by either say highlighting them and clicking run, or by using a shortcut, which on a Mac I can hold Command Shift and then hit return, and that runs everything. And you'll notice I created a plot here, and that plot appears in the lower right hand window. If I'd like to use that plot in something else, I could export it. You could save it as an image, save it as a PDF. And then if I wanted to say shut down R and come back to it later, I could save my script, quit R, rerun it, and in RStudio my script will still be sitting there. So as a little introduction to how R works, let's take a closer look at this little piece of information here. These are 4 numbers that maybe represent some data that I collected, and maybe I want to do things with this data set, like plot it. I just did that. Or maybe I'd like to find the average, or maybe I'd like to find the maximum value. If I just had the numbers like this, say maybe separated by commas, and I tried to put that into my plotting function, and I ran that, I get this weird error message, which can happen in R. There's lots of ways for things to go wrong, unfortunately. And sometimes the error messages will make sense, sometimes they won't. And for this one, there's something happening. What's happening is not that important. But the important part is that if I want to work with numbers like this in R, what I need to do is group them to have them be a cohesive structure. And what we're going to do is create a vector using this little function called C for concatenate. And plot and C are the names of functions. Just like in math, functions are followed by sets of parentheses, and then within the parentheses go what we call the arguments. So anyway, I'm using the C function to create a little vector of 4 numbers. And if I run that, the only thing that happens is I am displayed the 4 numbers back again. As you saw earlier, If I put those 4 numbers within that C function inside of the plot function, then that's the format it's expecting, and I get this displayed plot here. But you can imagine that if this was a very large group of numbers, then sticking it inside of a function like plot might be a little bit awkward. So a way that R works is almost anything can be saved as an object. And how you do that is through what's called assignment. And the syntax for doing that is to name your object. I'm going to cleverly call this my object. And then you could use an equals sign if you want, but what's seen as a better operator for assigning a value to an object is to use a left arrow sign, which is created by 2 characters. The greater than symbol here, this thing that opens to the right, and then a hyphen, a minus sign. And so within RStudio, if I run this, the output isn't actually anything in the console. And if I look up here, I see what happened is that my object was created. It happens to be numeric, and this is telling me there's 10 of these numbers. And so now that I have something called my object, I could refer to it by name. I could use the plot function again, and instead of putting in all this amount of code, I could just say I would like to plot my object. Run that. I'm going to zoom back out here. And then I get the following plot down here. So any objects you create end up being shown here in RStudio in the environment. Let's say again I wanted to quit R, go do something else. When I quit, I get this message, which is a little bit obtuse. The language in R messages and error messages and prompts can sometimes be a little bit technical sounding. But this is saying save workspace image to this specific place, and pretty much every single time you are asked this, you should not save it, because when I don't save it and then I reload R, any objects that I had made before will be gone. And that's what we want, fresh start every time. Otherwise things just accumulate. But you'll notice now if I just go down here and try to say look at my object, I'm like, oh, I forget what it was, and I run it. It says error, my object not found, because I started fresh, my workspace wasn't saved. I don't have any objects in my environment. When you don't save the workspace, you do start fresh, but that means that any code that you ran earlier that you'd like to use, you need to rerun that code. So I could rerun the my object line, and then if I try to look at it, that runs. So when you have data like this in R, you can do a lot of nice things with it. You could sort it with a sort function. And if you want to, you could even save that as a new object. I'm going to call that my sorted object. So now I have 2 different objects here, one in order and one not. So that's kind of nice. You can do things like find the average, find the median. Hey, they're the same. That's kind of interesting. You can find the standard deviation. That's an important idea of statistics. Each of these is a built-in function to R, and there's a lot of them. R even has libraries that you can add on additional functionality. One of the big strengths of R is that it's open source. People all over the world develop their own functions, their own ways of interacting with it. So you can pretty much accomplish whatever you'd like to with R. So looking into functions a little bit more, maybe you sorted this function and you'll notice it went from low to high, and maybe you're wondering, oh, can I sort that from high to low? How does the sort function work? If you want to find some help on a certain topic in R, a lot of times you can just put a question mark before the name of that topic, run that, and what you get over here is the help file about how does that function work. And if you look right here, what it's giving you some ideas of how this function is running in its default setting, which is saying, okay, you're sorting this X according to this argument section down here is the thing that you're sorting. And then, hey, there's this other argument that's there that by default is set to false, decreasing equals false. But if I would like that to be true, I could run sort, and I could sort my object, and I'm now going to add a second argument. My object is one argument, here's another argument, And that argument is going to be decreasing, and instead of false, I'm going to set it to true. And when I run this, what I get is my object, and now it's starting from the highest value and sorted in a decreasing order. So lots of functions in R can be used in a minimalistic way, like say sort. I can just run it without any additional arguments. But then there's different options you can add to increase the functionality to do different things if you would like. So now let's take a look at working with a data set in R. I made a video about importing comma-separated value files into R. That's a very frequently seen type of data. But for this video, we're just going to use a built-in data set, this one called cars. And if I look at the help file for that, it says the data gives the speed of cars and the distances taken to stop. Note the data were recorded in the 1920s. I think that's so funny that they have data that's 100 years old here. Anyway, if I save that as an object, what happens here is that in my environment, you'll see that I have another category open up. I have the values, those vectors that I created before, but then I also have this data set, which is 50 observations of 2 variables. And if I click on that, I get the name of the variables and I get the first couple values of them. So say you wanted to do something like find the average speed of these 50 data values. Well, the syntax for accessing a variable within a data set is to use the name of that data set followed by a $sign, and then the name of the variable that you'd like to work with. Let's choose speed. So when I run that, all I'm getting here are the 50 speed data values from this data set. So I could find the average of them if I wanted to. I could find the maximum value. I could make a visual display of them. I could make a box plot of them. That's a function in R. I could make a histogram of them. This happens a lot. So I've tried to type in histogram and it said couldn't find function histogram, and I'm realizing that the function name in base R for making a histogram is just hist. So the last thing I'll do is just go over some common ways that you can make a mistake in R. One is when you type in something like a function name and then you start the opening parentheses, it'll automatically give you that closing parentheses and you can put in some inputs between them. But sometimes you'll get confused on parentheses and somehow you might end up with too many parentheses going in one direction and not as many in the other. And one thing that's nice is that when your code is not looking so great, RStudio will give you a little hint here and say, oh, hey, there's some problem. And when I hover my mouse over that, it even describes the problem. Hey, there's a right-facing parentheses here that doesn't have a match. But say I was just going quickly and I wasn't paying attention to that and I ran this. What happens is that R, instead of executing that code, it gives me this plus sign. It's saying, hey, I'm waiting for more things. I'm waiting for you to finish that. And if I do something weird like that, it's not going to like it. And sometimes you might come down to here and think, okay, does it just want me to hit enter more? And you'll just keep getting more and more plus signs. And all it wants you to do is to give it the closing parentheses. And then it finally runs. Another thing you can do is that when you have arguments in a function, they need to be separated by commas. And if you forget a comma and you run it, you get kind of a strange sounding error message that, hey, there's an unexpected numeric constant. Oh, I should add my parentheses. I'm still going to get the same error message. It's basically saying something is appearing where it shouldn't, and why that's happening is because there's no comma between the arguments. And I did say that spaces don't matter, but if you have a space, say, between the name of a function, that's a problem. Names in R, whether they're the names of functions or the names of variables, spacing within those things does matter. So this was a very basic how-to for writing code in R. One of the best ways, I think, to get more familiar is just to mess around with things. Click around, try different things, see what works, see what doesn't. There's a lot of tutorials out there. Googling error messages can be a good way to try to problem solve. There's a lot of resources. If you ever have any issues, you're always welcome to reach out to me. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you later.